Are you ready for a paradigm shift? Because economic growth, that great godlike goal of the USA, has become the biggest threat of the 21st century. You don't think so? What do you think is the biggest threat? You think it's an environmental issue like climate change or plummeting biodiversity? Or maybe an ever-present economic issue in some parts of the world like runaway inflation or rampant unemployment? Or the international strife that's caused by these economic and environmental crises and that threatens the proliferation of warfare at any time? Well, here's the thing. Economic growth is the mother of all of these threats and many others. And if you're not familiar with why, you're going to want to watch the rest of this film, and especially the last couple minutes where we talk about solutions. We'll start out by demystifying economic growth. You know, there's nothing magical or mysterious about economic growth. It's not like manna from heaven. Economic growth is simply increasing production and consumption of goods and services in the aggregate. And that's a key phrase, in the aggregate. So it's not, for example, just installing more solar panels here or providing more information there. It's the growth of the whole integrated economy. And it starts at the agricultural base. Just think of the farmers out there in the fields in the USA that produce so much more than they need just themselves to eat. That's what allows the rest of us to not be out in the fields or hunting or raiding somebody else's camp. That's what allows for the division of labor into all these other activities, like installing the solar panels here and providing the information there. Now, when you think about this fundamental structure of the economy with its agricultural base, then it's very easy to see through this fuzzy notion of perpetual economic growth. And think about economic growth in addition to just being production and consumption of goods and services. That means you have to have increasing population and or per capita consumption. And that's measured by GDP, or gross domestic product. And here's something to realize about GDP, because sometimes a misunderstanding of what GDP really is can really derail sustainability discussions. GDP doesn't account for things like sticking dollars into a slot machine or buying derivatives in the financial markets. You might consider those to be like whirlpools outside the real river of GDP, outside the real economy, in other words, which is what is measured with GDP. So the economy has this trophic structure with the agricultural and extractive sectors at the base, and then the manufacturing sectors from the heaviest to the lightest, like computer chip manufacturing, and it's assisted with all kinds of information sectors and transportation sectors and service sectors in general. Now, when confronted with the fundamental structure of the economy, a typical economist, they'll acknowledge, yeah, okay, there are limits to growth, but those limits are so far off, we don't need to worry about that right now. But now you're in a totally different discussion. There's no argument about whether there are limits to growth. Of course there are limits to growth. The question is just how far off really are those limits? And then you rapidly come to the next question, which is it even smart now to be pulling out all the stops for economic growth when we're doing things like fracking over vast regions and mining for tar sands and shale oil, and thinking about proliferation of our nuclear footprint to be able to have the energy to conduct all these economic activities. And then you start to think about all of the side effects, all the noise, all the congestion, all of the threats to physiological and mental health, and caused by the stress and caused by pollutants. Not to mention the existential threats, like the melting of the polar ice caps and the potential for runaway climate change. So it doesn't take long to think that we have to do something different than striving for perpetual economic growth. And so what is the sustainable alternative? Well, we know that's not sustainable, that perpetual growth. That's not sustainable either. So the sustainable alternative is the middle ground, the steady state economy, we call it, with mildly fluctuating GDP, mildly fluctuating population and per capita consumption. It's not going to be a flatlined economy. That would be impossible, and there needs to be room for plenty of technological innovation and difference and evolution of consumer preferences and things like that. So mildly fluctuating, and ideally at the right size, ideally at the best size for our democracy at large. In fact, that's the biggest challenge for democracy in the 21st century, is to find that right size of the economy to establish that steady state at. And how would we do that? Well, we do it from two angles, the demand side and the supply side. And so from the demand side, we have to think about consumption as a matter of citizenship. So is it good citizenship to do things like driving Hummers and building McMansions and wearing the biggest fur coat you can find, or the biggest diamond that you can get mined in Africa, that type of thing? It's probably not very good citizenship in the 21st century. Now, from the supply side, we can go straight to the central pillar of economic growth policy in the United States, which is the Full Employment Act. Now, we're all for full employment, of course, but we've recognized now that you can't have perpetually more jobs, you can't have perpetually more people, a perpetually growing economy, or perpetually more jobs. So we want to amend that Full Employment Act to the Full and Sustainable Employment Act, or the FSEA. You know, the current Full Employment Act that we have, it's premised upon the metaphor of a rising tide lifts all boats. But now we know that there's not enough, you can't have perpetually more water for raising the tide, there's not perpetually more boat building materials. So we need to stabilize the waters at the steady state economy. And the reason I mention this is that we might call the Full and Sustainable Employment Act, the FSEA, the Full Seas Act. So we want to establish that steady state economy because the seas are full, and the way to do this, fortunately, does not entail anything revolutionary or radical or new. What it really entails is adjusting the current collection of levers and buttons that are currently set for GDP growth. So the fiscal and monetary policies, basically. The budgets, and the tax codes, the interest rates, the fractional reserve banking system. We need to reform these things so that they are conducive to the steady state economy at the right size. And then in international affairs, we need to practice steady statesmanship, leading toward global steady state economies. And when we look at economic growth as having become the biggest threat of the 21st century, now is the time to start toward the steady state economy.